So we have all our salmon put up. It's not quite moose season, it is berry picking season. It's also a good time of year to talk about gardening and some strategies that we use to have some successful gardens in Alaska. Now, what's behind me is the garden at our new place, which is still quite new and under development. But we brought over some strategies from our old place, and I'll show you some of those gardens as well. But our main challenges for gardening in Alaska are, number one, soil temperature. And we also have soil fertility issues. We have length of growing season issues. And sometimes soil moisture and pests. So we're going to talk about how we deal with those 5 challenges. So you see we've got some ducks playing in this little kiddie pool over here. We keep a little kiddie pool of water in the garden just for easy watering access. We can just dip a watering can in there and water it. We keep the ducks handy for slug control, but before we planted the garden, we also had a lot of the birds kind of running loose in here, eating whatever insects they could out of the soil and also fertilizing it because they're pooping constantly. Now you might say, oh, look at that water, it's turning gross. Well, water with all that duck stuff in it's only going to be even better for the plants. So this garden is oriented in a way that it slopes gently to the south. We have this kind of backdrop behind it of old stumps and logs and stuff. And we're also using these raised beds that you see kind of lined up along the backstop. So that's how we're dealing with soil temperature issues. We have our potatoes in rows here. That's kind of a normal thing for potatoes. Potatoes don't really need any of that extra heat. So we just have potatoes planted directly in the ground. But most other things that aren't potatoes, we try to put in some kind of container or raised bed. So we had a lot of these logs sitting on a slash pile on the neighboring lot. And so Megan just grabbed a bunch and made these beds. Got some, lettuce and we've got beets and cabbage and some peas there in this little spot. That's going to be a lilac. It got really eaten down by the local bunnies. We'll talk about them in a minute. Got some tomatoes going to be growing on these little tomato plants here. More peas, lettuce, various oniony things. There's a little bean in there. Here's a couple of haskaps that I planted using the method I showed in a previous video. We've got some clover growing in random spots in the ground. That kind of helps a little bit with soil nutrition. We got a bunch of carrots in here. We've also been harvesting a lot of stuff already too. So like this bed here was already full of turnips and we already harvested them all. We're starting our second round of stuff in this bed. You can see we got some chickweed, but we've also got some kale and some, what's that going to be, some beets there. When you extend your growing season with these raised beds and you have the extra soil temperature, you can get 2 crops out of certain vegetables. So soil temperature is more of an issue here in south central Alaska than it is more in interior Alaska. Up near like Fairbanks and Delta Junction, they have much warmer summers. The soils get warmer. Here we're a lot closer to the coast. We tend to be, we have more moisture in the soil, more muskeg areas that kind of keep things cool. So we do everything we can to raise the soil temperature. So these raised beds that are behind me, those kind of have things up off the ground. They've got the logs there for extra thermal mass. And we just fill them with a combination of like compost and topsoil and stuff like that. And the same thing for these kind of berms along the back. It provides thermal mass. It's along the north edge, so it kind of captures that sun coming from the south and holds its heat and moisture very well. It's kind of like a poor man's hugelkultur mound. It's not an official hugel mound, but it's when we had this area kind of, I'm not going to say cleared, but when we had this area kind of smoothed out to be turned into a garden, that's where all the stumps and stuff went. And these berms or backstops, things hold their heat a lot better when you have them like up off of the cooler ground. And that brings us into talking about soil fertility. Now, I mentioned we had the area, I didn't say cleared, but kind of smoothed out for a garden, because a lot of people are under the impression that you need to just like bulldoze the whole thing and start with a perfectly flat place that you can turn into rows of this or that. Now, we do our potatoes in rows, but that's mostly because we used a rototiller, because potatoes have a hard time growing in areas where the soil is really dense and compact. It needs to have kind of looser soil for the potatoes to grow easily. You can grow them above ground in like, containers. We've done like potato towers before, and that all works well and everything. But the thing is when you have a premium of this like raised bed space where you only have so much of it, we want to reserve that for the stuff that doesn't do so well in the ground as potatoes do. So, I mean, potatoes will grow just about anywhere. So that's why we have them in the ground. It's the most efficient way to use our space. But when we're talking about soil fertility, we don't have the best soils in Alaska. We have pretty decent soils right here. But most of that nutrition is in the topsoil itself. So if you're having a dozer or something scrape your land flat, you're losing most of your topsoil, which is where all the nutrition is. And then if you want your stuff to grow, well, what do you have to do? You have to import nutrition. So for a lot of people, what they're doing is they scrape all the topsoil away, which it's not just nutrition, but it's also got all kinds of great fungi in there. It's its whole own little ecosystem. But you scrape that away, you got to replace it with something. What are you replacing it with? Usually people will go buy some kind of fertilizer that comes from some factory somewhere and throw that in their soil. And so, yeah, you're getting nutrition that will grow your vegetables, but it's not the same, and it's not as good for your entire ecosystem that's growing in your garden. So we like to preserve our topsoil first and foremost. Even in places where we disturb it to do potatoes, we don't like move it away. It's still there. It's a little bit disturbed, but then we are adding compost to it. So here we are in the flower and herb garden at our old house. And everything you see planted here was just put straight into topsoil. Nothing was excavated away, no topsoil removed. We've just got, like valerian, roses. We've got a maple there, lilac, more roses, some mint. Delphiniums of various kinds. We had a Himalaya poppy there, but it's already too late in the season to see that. Same with the lilacs. Those are kind of early bloomers. What you probably hear is the sound of wild pollinators. They're everywhere. And that brings us to where we do get our extra nutrition from. Now, we don't buy commercial fertilizers or composts. We only use our own compost that we make. And we have a whole little video on humanure compost. We make compost out of everything. But we also have goats, chickens, ducks, etc. So sometimes we'll fill a raised bed with something like the goat poop straw that we scrape out of the goat house. We have horses, so we use a lot of horse manure. We have all these different animals that provide nutrition now. Now we do have ducks and chickens kind of browsing in here before we planted in the spring. Staked them out and tethered them, and the goats were just browsing in here. This is all future garden area here. We haven't done anything with this yet. Like I said, we just started this garden. But the goats were in here eating down the weeds and adding their goat poop and whatnot, so that was good. So that's kind of a direct way of doing it, having the goats kind of clear out weeds, add some nutrition. And I pointed out also that there's like clover and stuff. Clover is a nitrogen fixer. It adds nitrogen. It's not like tremendous, but it doesn't hurt. So those are the ways that we improve our soil nutrition. We also like to rotate where we plant things. We don't plant potatoes like in the same place for too many years in a row. We try to mix it up because classically, when you're talking about rotating your crops, you want to have a nitrogen fixer in a spot that something else was in the previous year. And then you kind of keep rotating it around, so those, like we've got peas over there, so that those peas are adding nitrogen back to where whatever was there last year took the nitrogen away. There's another benefit of having your clover and whatnot in any kind of flowering plant is you get a lot of bumblebees and local wild pollinators that might help pollinate your tomatoes or whatever. Speaking of places for pollinators, we got a ton of fireweed over here. Now in this area it actually kind of opens up nicely in the middle, and we had intended on putting a garden in that area, but as you can see, it's got a lot of trees around it, which brings us to our next challenge, which is length of growing season. Part of the problem with the growing season in Alaska is you need to find ways of getting your plants that sunlight. Now, it doesn't seem like it should be an issue because we have so much sun during the summer. But if your garden is surrounded by trees, it's not going to be getting a lot of sunlight. So you do kind of need an area that's open. Now, ours is mostly open to the south. During the middle of summer, that doesn't matter so much because the sun is kind of so overhead and it's not so low on the horizon. But earlier in the season, like in spring, and later in the season in fall, when the sun starts to get lower to the horizon, having this southern orientation really helps. So making sure you're not kind of surrounded by trees and that you have something of a southerly orientation if possible are kind of main ways of extending your growing season. We already talked about having kind of the thermal mass and the raised beds that also extend your growing season, because when we have these berms like this, we have noticed that what's the first place that thaws out in spring? The south faces of these berms and the area right in front of it. Well, where's our garden? That first place that thaws out in spring. So that gives us a head start on planting in these areas. It's the first stuff to get that spring sun, melts, thaws, and then we can start planting stuff. So that extends our growing season. Another thing we do is use our greenhouse to get seeds started indoors, so then we can transplant it out here. So here's our current greenhouse. Now, normally we'll start seeds inside the house where it's warmer in the earlier part of spring, maybe like March or something. And then as things warm up, we'll move them out to these shelves in the greenhouse. And then we move them outside. And we do this in waves, like we'll get the first wave of seedlings onto the shelves, and then we start the next ones inside, and then as the ones on the shelves move outdoors, the ones from inside move out to the shelves, and on and on and on. But by this time of summer, the only things left in the greenhouse are things that we want a lot of heat for, like cucumbers and tomatoes, things like that. But we do grow some tomatoes outside as well. But that brings us around to something else. If you kind of look down here, we're walking downhill, and what I'm talking about is there's like a low area down here by the driveway. And low areas, especially when it comes to springtime and fall time, low areas are the places that cold air is going to gather, and you're going to get frosts in the night, whereas you might get frost down here in this low spot by the driveway. You're not going to get frost up here where there's all this thermal mass. So a big part about extending your growing season is knowing your local microclimate. Now everywhere has its own little microclimate, places that the air moves, places that cold air settles, places that things tend to be warmer than others. And the only real way to know how to use your microclimate is to spend years there and make observations. Now this is our first year of having this garden, but we've had this property for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years or something like that. So we've had the time to make observations. And while this is not the warmest spot and the best spot for a garden, its proximity to a well for watering, its proximity to a house, makes it an obvious choice. So even though it might not be the warmest spot, again, we're making up for it by using these backstops and raised beds and using these other strategies. So it's partially convenience, but there's definitely strategy behind it. Those ducks are so loud. Anyways, on to the next challenge of soil moisture, which is not really as much of a challenge as the others. We happen to live in a part of Alaska where we get regular rainfall in the summer, and that's by design. I mean, I had the opportunity back in the 2000s to do a lot of research, a lot of climate research on different parts of Alaska, and when I was narrowing my ideas down of which are the best places to live, regular rainfall and sufficient rainfall was a big part of it. Now, when you're gardening, most of what you're eating, vegetables and fruit-wise, is water, right? Most of these things are all just water with some nutrients. So what you're getting is water and some nutrition and calories and fiber and vitamins, whatever, you know, but it's still mostly water. So having these mounds behind your garden or around your garden or in your garden is great for retaining soil moisture. It's got this rotting wood that really, really holds moisture well. Same things with these raised beds, you know, because we're making it out of old logs. That spongy wood really, really helps retain water. And something else, earlier when I was talking about maintaining your topsoil, is the topsoils we have in Alaska are kind of it's like an organic mat, and it really holds moisture well also. And when you scrape that away, you're really harming your ability to maintain soil moisture. If you just kind of scrape it away to the silty layer that's below it, and then you add nutrition back in, well, okay, you might be getting the right amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and whatever else, but that water is going to just sink right through because you don't have the appropriate organic sponge there to hold all that moisture around the roots of the plants where you want it. And also, you know, you're going to have to water at some point. I already showed you our little, you know, we've got a little kiddie pool there with water that we can just kind of scoop out and water when we need to. We have a well about 50 feet that way that we haven't even used this summer. It's actually out of commission at the moment. I'm waiting for a new well cap. But even once that is reinstalled, we're not really going to need it for watering the garden. But you may want to strategically plan your garden with that in mind. How am I going to get water to the garden? So for us, we kind of planned it around our local climate. And all of these strategies kind of work together. The thermal mass, raised beds, keeping your topsoil, using your kind of local compost and manures. All of it not only helps extend your growing season, helps your nutrition, also helps keep things moist. This is one of the gardens at our old house. And in this garden, we have a little setup here where we've got a gutter coming off of this little barn down into this rain barrel that has a spigot. And so what we can do is for everything that's at a lower elevation than the rain barrel, we can just put a hose and let gravity water the garden if we want to. So that's a helpful thing. If you can get water feeding into a rain barrel at higher elevation than your plants, that's an easy way to water your stuff without using electricity. So we still have those ducks over there, and that's a good opportunity to talk about pests. Because have a look at this little cabbage here, and what do you notice? Slugs have been at it. Okay? That's one of the reasons that we have ducks. Ducks love to eat slugs. I wonder what this would look like if we didn't have ducks. I don't know. But something that we have come to accept is that we will never, ever win the battle against slugs. We have to accept the things that we cannot change. Now, we can make little slug traps, and that works. I don't know if it's necessarily worth the effort. We can have ducks, which we are going to have anyway, and that also helps. There's a bug on the microphone there. Anyway, the slugs, yeah, they eat some of these leaves, but we have chosen to deal with slugs mostly by just not caring. So what does that mean? Well, that means that, okay, so here's a cabbage that the slugs have been at, and we're going to wash it anyway. So whatever slugs are on these vegetables, they're going to get washed off. And even if we wanted to eat this rugged outer leaf, we could still eat that. Just wash it off, wash off the slug slime. Guess what? It's still edible. So part of it is just not being squeamish. We're going to eat after the slugs one way or another. Yay, we've got some pollinators in our peas. Look at them go there. Yes, go pollinate those peas. Do your job, bug. Here's another pest we have. Invasive weeds. With invasive weeds, we have to pick our battles. Some we weed, some we don't. This one needs to get weeded. This is an autumn hawkbit, and it spreads pretty profusely. The main one that we worry about is orange hawkweed. If you see any of that, you get rid of it. But over there, you see we just have a regular old dandelion. We don't worry too much about those. We've got, Sitka burnet growing. We've got little fireweeds. We've got horsetail, and we've got grasses. None of them really require too much attention from us. And we can go in between these rows and weed everything. Doesn't need too much weeding. Your main defense against weeds is going to be healthy soil. If you have very nutritious soil, the weeds tend to prefer crappy soils. So keep your soil nutrition high and your weeding will be easier. Another thing about weeds is that they tend to prefer disturbed areas. So here's, we've got this potato patch. This is a disturbed area. We have kind of broken up the topsoil, and it allows weeds to get in. If you can avoid breaking up the topsoil, then you don't really give weeds a place to get a foothold. You maintain your native vegetation, and what grows there is what's supposed to be growing there and what's always grown there. Or if you bring in your kind of compost and manure and other topsoil for these things, you can even kind of garden it so densely that weeds don't really have a place to grow, don't get much light. But also, this is much more nutritious soil, so the weeds are not going to gravitate towards it. And in places where the weeds get really bad, you can do one of these. We get some brown cardboard, make sure we tear all the tape off of it, lay it out over weedy spots, cover it with horse manure, and it grows old soccer balls. Well, actually, no, it just kills the weeds, and then we can grow stuff here in the future. Other pests that we have to worry about are basically snowshoe hares and moose. Now, I showed this little lilac earlier. This thing got eaten down tremendously by hares. You can see that the bark there was chewed, and it is recovering. We thought it was a total loss. We've had super high numbers of snowshoe hares for like 5 years now, which is weird. Usually snowshoe hares go on a 10-year cycle where you've got like 2 really high years, and then the population declines because predators, in particular lynx, start to eat them like crazy, and then you get a bunch of lynx, but then there's not enough rabbits for the lynx, so the lynx population crashes, and they kind of work off of each other like that. But locally, we've had a couple of trappers targeting lynx, and it's really upset the balance with snowshoe hares, so we just have an overabundance of snowshoe hares for like 5 years in a row, and it's really doing a number on some of our gardening efforts. So what do you do about them? Well, you hunt them, you eat them, you feed them to your dogs. We do all of those things. And kind of having like dogs and cats right around the house also helps, because they kind of chase, sometimes hunt them on their own. We have had our dogs and our cats successfully hunting snowshoe hares. So that helps. And then when it comes to moose, a lot of people like to fence their gardens. But there's basically no fence you can build that will really keep a moose out. If a moose wants to get into your fenced garden, it's going to get into your fenced garden. Even if your fences are like 6 feet tall, which we have had moose get into our gardens with 6 foot tall fencing. It does deter them to some extent, but if a moose is motivated, there's really no fence that's going to stop it. Just like having the immediate area next to the house, having your garden very nearby where you can keep an eye on it, having some animals that will annoy the moose, just kind of keeping watch, because gardening in Alaska is always going to be a challenge. It's always going to be hard because it's just not the best place for gardening. You can make it work, but it's also really frustrating to put in a ton of work to build a garden and then to lose it all to moose. But there are other strategies there. So like in front of me here is our potato patch. Nothing eats potatoes. The leaves of potatoes are poisonous. I've known some people, they will plant rows of potatoes, but they'll plant other things in between those rows. So it's like the animals, they are deterred by the potatoes. They're like, oh no, I don't want to eat that. And then they kind of also ignore the things that are between the rows of potatoes. We've tried that ourselves. And it does work to some extent. But if it's hares, I don't think that they're going to miss out on some deliciousness that's just between rows of potatoes. It'll probably deter moose, though. And here's another little garden we have at the old house. We got some raised beds here growing some vegetables, and there's a few potatoes in the open area, and then a hedge of raspberries around the back. There goes a songbird, probably eating our raspberries as they're growing. But this one, we have this welded wire fencing with 2-inch by 4-inch openings. And we have found that it's pretty fragile. It's easily broken by moose or whatnot. But that also some of the smaller snowshoe hares can fit even inside of those things, because we found some bunnies in here before. So it's really, really hard to keep those pests, really hard to keep those animals out of your garden if they want to be there. So there you have it. That's basically how we go about dealing with the challenges of gardening in Alaska. And you know, we've had varying degrees of success over the years, and you're also going to be choosing, you know, specific kinds of things that grow well in your spot. Here where we are, you know, cabbage and potatoes do really well. Kale does well, garlic does well. Tomatoes usually don't do too well outside, but if we have them kind of up against one of these backstops and stuff, they'll grow outside if they've got all that thermal mass keeping them warm. And you know, we do like to eat lots and lots of wild vegetable matter because we don't have to plant that, we don't have to maintain it, it just exists. And if you know what you're eating, you can get as much of that or as little of that as you want, because everything that you see here growing, it's great, right? But it's all hard fought. You have to plan around it. You have to watch it. You have to make sure that you keep the moose and the bunnies out. You're never going to beat the slugs unless you start to throw some really nasty stuff on your plants. But we don't do that. But you can make it work. The real question is all that work worth it? For some things, I would say it's not worth it. You know, a lot of times you might just be better off harvesting your wild plants that fit the same niche in your diet. But for potatoes are always a sure thing. You know, we do like cabbage because it makes sauerkraut, and that stores very well. We definitely will always do garlic. And our root vegetables usually do well. It's like some of these things, okay, yeah, there's not a lot of good wild equivalents for it in terms of like the amount of calories you get from it. You got to try things out, see if it works. If it fails, you either give up on it or you try a new strategy for making it work. Ultimately, you're just going to end up sticking with what works. And that's what we've done here is, you know, we've been gardening for well over a decade in Alaska. We've been sticking with what works. And so that ends up with some potatoes in the tilled ground, raised beds against a backstop here, starting things in the greenhouse, having, you know, compost and manure and some slug control ducts. I mean, all this stuff works. It's just, is it worth the effort? For us it is, that's why we keep doing it. But there's so many things that we've stopped doing that weren't worth the effort that you'll just have to learn those things on your own. But you can make it work. But hopefully these tips will help you plan your own garden and that you can have some success. You know, this is what works for us. In most parts of Alaska, it'll probably work for you, but you know, not necessarily. It depends on your microclimate, depends on your soil, depends on your availability of water, depends on your local wildlife. You might have a lot fewer snowshoe hares than we do. You might have a lot easier time growing stuff. So you just don't know until you try. So give it a shot.